Alright, so today we are going to talk about biological sex because a lot of people are talking about it, and a lot of what's being said is just silly, as it's clear most people don't know what they're talking about, resulting in a lot of misinformation and just dumb things being said. So I wanted to share my opinions and hopefully educate some people on biological sex. But in order to do that, I need to explain to you what sex determination and sex development are. Starting with sex determination, so how your sex is determined. In order to understand how sex is determined, we need to understand chromosomes and how embryos are created. So first, what are chromosomes? Well, chromosomes are just long strands of DNA packaged together that take on the shape of a thread-like structure called a double helix. And that DNA carries genetic information in the form of genes, with genes being a section of your DNA that usually codes for a specific protein, and those proteins carry out specific functions within the cell that ultimately manifest as and influence observable physical characteristics like eye color and height. And these chromosomes carry all of the genetic information of a living organism, and there are two types: autosomes and sex chromosomes. Autosomes are just chromosomes that aren't sex chromosomes, and sex chromosomes are chromosomes that carry the genes that determine the sex of an organism. So a chromosome involved with determining which reproductive biology you will develop, and we inherit one sex chromosome from each of our parents. These chromosomes are carried in the sperm and eggs we produce, and those eggs and sperm are what are known as gametes. Gametes are just mature male or female germ cells which are able to combine with each other to form a zygote, which is just a fertilized egg, and these gametes are known as haploids, meaning they only have one set of unpaired chromosomes, that being 23, which means they can be matched with another, which is why we need both. They need the other to become complete, as we need 46 chromosomes in total, and egg cells have an X chromosome, and sperm cells can either have an X chromosome or a Y chromosome. Depending on the combination of sex chromosomes you get, that'll determine what sex you begin to develop as. XX for female and XY for male, usually, which means that it's the sperm that determines the sex of a zygote. And genes pertaining to the development of our reproductive system are contained in both of our sex chromosomes, with some in our autosomes. So our chromosomes will determine our sex by determining what sexual anatomy we will develop, with the help of sex hormones, which are just substances that can stimulate specific cells or tissues into action. The way our chromosomes do this is by using the most important part of sex determination, which is the SRY gene, which determines whether or not an embryo will begin to develop male or not. When present and turned on, it will help promote the development of testicles, marking the first step towards male development in the embryo. It does this by producing SRY protein that binds to specific regions of DNA and helps control the activity of particular genes, directs the development of the gonads into testicles, and prevents the development of female reproductive biology. It is located on the Y chromosome, which is why those with Y chromosomes tend to be born male. So how does sexual development happen? Well, first you need to know that genes aren't always turned on, meaning they aren't always producing messenger RNA or proteins, despite each cell having a copy of your entire genome, as each cell only turns on a fraction of its genes at any given time. The rest are turned off. This process of turning genes on and off is known as gene regulation. This applies to the development of our reproductive system as well. If the SRY gene is present and turned on, it'll lead to the development of testicles, and if everything else goes right, our secondary sex organs as well. But everything that develops after our gonads are also determined by whether or not certain hormones are produced or not, and your cell's ability to respond to them. Those hormones are the anti-Müllerian hormone, testosterone, and dihydrotestosterone. These are the primary male sex hormones. They are most produced by our gonads, which are the two primary sex hormones that produce our gametes, but also produce a lot of different hormones. The ones listed above are produced from the testicles. Estrogen is produced from the ovaries and refers to a group of hormones, and they are the primary sex hormone of women. But testosterone and estrogen are produced in both males and females, and these hormones are responsible for the function, development, and sexual health of our bodies. So depending on if these three specific hormones are released or not, that will determine whether or not you'll continue to develop male or female. If you continue down the male path, your Wolffian ducts, which are the ducts responsible for the development of the male reproductive tract, will begin developing into the male reproductive system. At the beginning, all embryos start off with no distinct sexual anatomy until about 6 weeks or so of pregnancy, when the testicles in males begin to develop, but the internal sex organs will continue to look the same until about 9 weeks of pregnancy. The external sex organs don't start to differ from each other until about 11 weeks of pregnancy. Before the external genitalia start to differ from each other, the genital buds are the same, and begin to form at around 4 to 5 weeks of pregnancy. So we have the same gonads and genital buds for our external genitalia until sex development begins. So just remember, sex chromosomes determine our primary sex organs, which are our gonads, and our gonads, through the absence or release of certain hormones, determine the development of your secondary sex organs. After some time, the development of your reproductive system will be complete at about week 20 for both boys and girls, though for boys, the testicles will have to descend into the scrotum, which usually happens at around week 25 to 35, but can also happen way later or after birth. After this, and you fully develop, both in terms of your sexual and non-sexual biology, you are born, and doctors determine your sex by looking at your external genitalia. So now that we have a better understanding of biology, how do we go about defining sex? But before that, we need to understand that biological sex revolves entirely around reproduction, so our definition should as well. Let's go over the best ways to define sex and the worst ways to define sex, starting with gamete production. Gamete production is a good way to define sex, as gamete production is what our reproductive system and the process of reproduction is built and centered around, and this is one of the main purposes of that system. The production of gametes is both important and necessary for reproduction, as they need to fuse together to create the embryo to pass on our genes. You can't pass on your genes or create offspring without them. It also works to categorize most organisms, though it isn't necessary to be male or female. Next is our reproductive system. Our reproductive system is also a good way to define sex, because our reproductive biology is important and necessary for the production, use of, and determination of our gamete production, and allows us to get the gametes to meet and fuse, along with carrying the embryo, taking care of it, and eventually giving birth to it. Our reproductive system is what the entire process of reproduction is based around, and is also important and necessary for reproduction. It is also important for the creation of offspring and the passing on of genes. It also works to categorize most organisms. Another good reason for why reproductive system is a good way to define sex is because it's physical, tangible, and measurable. It properly separates the two primary sex classes, and it is also necessary for being male or female. The others are not. But there's also a way of defining sex that is incorrect, that being chromosomes, or your karyotype, which is just the appearance and number of your chromosomes. Despite the fact that chromosomes determine our sex, they aren't our sex. Though your chromosomes and sex do often match, for the vast majority of people, they are a blueprint for making you, including your sex, but they aren't your sex itself. They hold DNA, which hold genes, which create the proteins that influence the physical characteristics that make up you. Same logic applies to genetics. They also aren't your sex, just information. Information your body relies on to create you. I also think that sex should be defined by physical, tangible characteristics, and we should determine one's sex based on the physical characteristics they developed, not what characteristics they hypothetically would have developed based on their karyotype and genetics. Karyotype determines what sex you develop as. Your phenotype, which includes your anatomy, determines what sex you are. At best, karyotype can be used to determine what someone's sex is, as karyotype and phenotype tend to match, but that's it. So how do we define sex? Well, I think either gamete production or our reproductive system is a fine way of defining sex, which makes sense as both are usually tied together. However, I think there's a clear winner that stands above the rest and is the most logical way of defining sex, that being your reproductive system. So I think the best way to define sex is as either of the two main categories, male or female, in which most organisms are placed in on the basis of their reproductive system. The reason I choose to define sex using your reproductive system, which comprises of your primary sexual characteristics, is because unlike the other two, gamete production and karyotype, this is necessary to be male or female. You don't need the entire thing, but even if you have just a few, we can determine your sex using that. But let's get into my final thoughts. Defining sex is very important. It's important for progress, for society, and for science, especially biology, and in a time where there's a lot of misinformation and lies, I think it's more important than ever to educate people on this topic and to be educated. But that is all for this video. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in my next video, which will also be on biology and sex. So I will see you then.